on Katan, but we have a number of weeks now together where we're going to try to pull together and add some more clinical issues. From here on, the theory becomes more clinical, and hopefully we'll be pulling together the pieces all the time so that by the end of the year, any one of you could give this course. How's that? Now, what you see on the board is a little bit of biology. And we're going to start with that so we can understand certain terms, because groups and families, the theory about how people interact, a lot of the theory was imported from biology. And you need to know what the theory was in biology in order to know how it's not exactly in families. Otherwise, you get confused with the terms. So, we're going to talk for a minute about body temperature. Everybody know what their body temperature is right now? Right? If you don't know, then you're okay. In other words, body temperature is something, pregnant people excluded, body temperature is something that you're not supposed to be aware of. In other words, when you're in the normal range, you don't know about it. So here is the possibility of temperatures on the face of our planet. Actually, before global warming, the maximum was 50. We've exceeded 50. But the planet outside of us can have a temperature between minus 30 and plus 50 degrees centigrade, right? However, our body temperature has a much smaller range. That's the range. It's between about 41.2 and 34. And when you exceed this very small range, which has to be exquisitely adapted and regulated, then you become part of the environment, which means you die. And when you die, you become dust, and dust is part of the environment. And so you're no longer within the internal system, you're in the outside system. If you go over about 41 or 42, you become environment, and you go from dust to dust. There are two ways to get dust: too much temperature and too little temperature. Why is the body so sensitive to temperature? And by the way, it's even more sensitive to acidity. The acidity has to be regulated even more exquisitely than the temperature, because when things heat up, molecules move faster. And when things get cold, molecules move more slowly. And when the molecules move too fast or too slow, all of the biological processes become interrupted. They have to have a certain pace. Timing and pace is a part of our world. Now, within what we can survive, there's also this tiny little range of what feels normal, which hopefully everybody here feels because they don't feel it. And that is between about 36.5 and 38. And that's what's called normal, or well, and that's when things are okay. And then you don't have to even notice it. Now, on the way from being normal or well to becoming dust, you have two situations which are experienced as abnormal. And we call those illnesses, right? In other words, when you have a fever, right, when your temperature goes up above about 38, then what are you feeling? Temperature has gone up, you start to feel ill. Ill is on the way to dust, right? If the body temperature has gone too high or too low, there's an indicator that something that's supposed to be inside is coming from the outside. There's a confusion here where the inside is on the way to becoming the outside. The environment is impinging, right? In other words, you're getting to a temperature which is from the environment but doesn't suit the body functions, right? So illness is a sign that something is coming from outside that doesn't fit the inside, okay? Now, what's called homeostasis is connected to a French term called the internal environment. The internal environment was it's an oxymoron. There's an irony to it. It was a term created by a French physiologist named Claude Bernard. Those of you who have been in Paris, there's a street named after him. And now the word milieu is supposed to be referring to the outside, right? But he talked about the inner environment. In other words, the way that we regulate things inside so that things are safe. Safety is what, preservation is what has to be very, very regulated. Now, we've been talking about regulating here forever, right? So the regulation works that way. And when things are stable and regulated, then we refer to a state of homeostasis. Homeostasis is not referring to whether it's inside or outside, but how well regulated it is. So in normal terms, we like regulation. We need regulation. If we don't regulate our temperature well, and we don't treat it if it's on the way to illness, we end up becoming the environment. We end up being dust. Okay? Pretty simple? Okay. Now, if we look at human environments, you can see that there's a possibility of between 50 and minus 30 in let's say, control. In human terms, there can be absolute control and there can be absolutely no control, right? Those are two possibilities at the range. Now, no family lives in the environment. No family lives with absolute despotism or absolute anarchy. So the issue of control is going to find something in the middle, right? Something that's tolerable. For example, that parents tell a child, you have to be home by 2 a.m. Now, there are families who would say 1 a.m., there are families who would say 11 p.m., there are families who would say 4 a.m. This family feels that that by 2 a.m. is us. You know, there's a good Yiddish term for it, unseres, right? So what does that mean? Familiar, like family. What's familiar to us, what works for us, what's the inside homeostasis that's familiar and works well, is somewhere between, let's say you come home at midnight, somewhere between midnight and 4 a.m. are possibilities, because if it's before, but no family lives with, come home sometime between 12 and 4. They say be home by 2, right? In this particular family that I'm referring to. Why? Because that's unseres, that's ours. We're a family where the parents say 2. Why did they say 2? Who knows why they say 2? That's familiar to them. Maybe that's what they learned. It's familiar. So they say, by us, people come home by 2. Now, what happens if we don't, we seem to be not in the inner regulation, like the normal temperature. When you come home at 2, everybody says, nothing. Like you say, I don't have to take your temperature. It's good. Everybody knows. What happens if you come home at 12? Well, if you're supposed to be in a social setting, and the social setting is supposed to be going on until 2, and you come home at 12, so the parents say, nicht unseres. Something is, what's the matter? You weren't having a good time? What's the matter? You weren't getting along? What's the matter? You're too shy? What is the matter, right? And when a family says, what's the matter? The family is saying, are you from us or are you from them? In other words, are you from something like the environment, something that doesn't fit into what's comfortable and well regulated by us? So you come home too early, what's the matter? You didn't have a good time, right? Now, what happens if you come home too late? Who is influencing you? That's the first question. Who are you with that kept you there? The assumption is that there's something in the environment that's pulling you out of us towards something that's not us, right? And so that's an influence. And as a result, if you come home too early, you fail to be us. If you come home too late, we lock the door and you're part of the environment. Stay out, right? Now, is that every family? We're just taking one family as an example. Every family will be a little different. But you see that the family has, within a certain range, a certain smaller range. That's the point that we're looking at here. The normal range is rather narrow. In every group, every system, the inner system of feeling what's inside is narrowly defined. And that's for everybody's benefit. Everybody knows this is us. It feels right. When it seems to go outside of that, then it's looked at as something that belongs outside of us. It's not us, it's somebody else. We've been failing to make you sociable enough to stay out till 2, or somebody's from the outside is making you fail, and so stay out. Okay? Now, that's normal family functioning. In other words, homeostasis is a way of keeping a familiar feeling, a way of saying, this is us. So far, so good? Okay. Now, if we look at this and we say, what about closeness? So we talked before about control. Remember, we talked about power or control, and we talked about closeness or love, and we talked about self-esteem, right? Those are the 3 things that cover about 80% of what people do or don't do. So let's talk about family therapy here. Let's take Minuchin's terms, enmeshment and disengagement, and say that there's a very broad range in families of distance or closeness. What is the optimal range? If you remember, when we talked about Minuchin, we said there is no such thing as an optimal range. That when women criticized Minuchin in the 90s, they said, how do you know what's supposed to be? Well, you just take from your own family and say, that's supposed to be? There's lots of families. And if you recall, we said, wait a minute, the issue of enmeshment or disengagement is not something you can determine, but it's a function, right? It means within the system things work. Remember that? That the function of the subsystems is the ends, and the means is the boundaries, how much you're disengaged. That makes the subsystem function. If you recall, couple puts the kids outside the room, then they talk about the couples issues, so the couples issues are separate. But how far they put them away from the door, and for how long, different families are different, right? So in any situation between the absolute enmeshment and absolute engagement, there's a big range. A family will have to live within a certain range, right? There's a certain range within which it's normal. And here, for an example, I said that, when a family feels either that we have to understand each other, or we do understand each other, or we check to see if we understand each other, das ist unseres, that's us. If we have that issue of understanding, that it has a certain range to it. It's not a point, it's a range. And sometimes we check to see, did you understand what I said? That's us. Or I said, look, you have to understand what I'm saying. What do you mean you don't understand? You have to understand it. That's still us. And that's like the normal temperature. That's us. But outside of that is outside of the range, which is either nobody understands anything, that if you're not understood automatically, then you're not us. Everything has to be understood without checking, without talking. That's not us. Or everybody can think whatever they want. That's not us. And illness is something that's on the way. For example, if we go from we must understand each other to only what we all understand is understandable. No? That's heading towards enmeshment, which means what you just said has no meaning. Why? Because we don't all understand it. It's not, let me see if I understand it. It's, nah, that's nonsense. Ever hear that from families? Nonsense, right? For example, a kid says, why do I have to come home at 2? I'd like to come home at 3. Nonsense, right? We don't understand that. Or going towards enmeshment, that of course we all agree, right? So you say, it happens in politics. In Israel, people say, taskimiti. Instead of saying, do you agree with me, say, agree with me, right? So you say, here, this is the truth. You agree with me. And in the family, if the answer is no, that's not acceptable. Or we exist by agreeing. All of us, we all have the same feelings. We all agree about everything. There's no disagreement at all. That's us. That, for this family, is already outside of what's comfortable. Okay? Moving towards enmeshment. And moving towards disengagement, we could have statements like, if there's any conflict, that's a sign of misunderstanding. Conflict is not a good thing. Conflict belongs to the environment. There were those views out there Now, Jews have always had this way of talking about the Goy Shakop, for example, right? In other words, that this way of thinking isn't ours. It's outside of the ramp. And that happens in families too, when you say to yourself, where did you get that idea? That doesn't come from us. And since it conflicts with what we want, then it's outside. Now, what is it that we want? It could be that a father expects his son to learn 5 blocks, and the son is stuck on the 4th. That's also outside. He says, I can't get to the 5th, but you have to get to the 5th. You see, it can be in a very narrow, it can be in any sort of area. It could have to do with which sleeve is actually for our family or for the neighbor's family, and what kind of head covering. There's all sorts of places where the environment is broader than the inner system, and the inner system adjusts itself, but feels that it's moving towards the outside, and that everybody's losing by going to the outside if things aren't fitting into the normal temperature, which is a very narrow range in every culture. In every culture. This is not about, secular culture looking at Haredim and saying, you guys are narrow. Look at secular culture, it's the same narrow. It's just a different place to put the narrow, but it's all, people keep their groups together by having these regulations. Yeah?
I'm just wondering if you can have enmeshment and disengagement at the same time in one family. For example, I have a client who, she has a very narrow view, in my mind anyway, that, for example, she has, all her kids are Haredi apart from one who's living in Holland and with a non-Jewish girlfriend, not like off the derech, whatever you said. And so she has one son who's learning, but he wants to learn, instead of 100% of the time, he wants to learn 90% of the time and do 10% business.
Right.
She's not happy with that at all.
Right.
But the other kids act like he's completely out. So
Right.
I'm just wondering, she still has a relationship with him.
Right.
But I'm wondering, is that enmeshment with some and disengagement with another, or how does that work?
Okay, so that's a welcome question, because if you recall, when we talked about the notion as that range, we critiqued it, didn't we? We said that low differentiation can be expressed by enmeshment or disengagement, because what's common to them? No conversation, no ability to create future. So when Maria sees Minushin showing up on the board, you asked exactly the right question, right? So you're absolutely right. Lower differentiation families will often have both elements of the enmeshment and the disengagement, and that means that Minushin is wrong in saying that there's a range. Or you could say that in the lower the differentiation of the family, the more narrow this inner setting, and then anything that goes a little above or below is already considered to be out.
But what's really interesting with this client is that, I mean, she's extremely...
Did everybody understand what we're talking about? Because you'll see it in families all the time. Yeah.
Because it's not that husher, like sit black and white. So this client, she's extremely, and she knows it, very critical of all her children, her husband, herself. That's like one of her issues. But with the kid who's out in Holland, the way she talks about him is so kind of, it's almost like it's so free of all her criticisms and boundaries and views, because he's so out. She actually, it sounds like she has a very good relationship with him, because she almost has no expectations of him.
Right.
So I'm wondering if that is, it's not disengagement or enmeshment, it's actually high differentiation with this kid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, now, so what are we trying to say here? We're trying to say that this intersection, this is us, is precious. It's precious for the entire family. It's not the enemy, right? In other words, the family needs to have something inside where we say, this is us. Now, what happens in a generation or in 2 generations or in a different country or a different society where there's a need to have some element of movement or of change? What is the need? See, here we have one element of change would be this. See, when you're in the inside, you have these 3 possibilities of understanding. And what happens if somebody moves to the outside, right? Somebody says something that doesn't happen to be in normal temperature. It's a little closer to cold, right? It's a little closer to disengaged. Somebody says, you know, we don't have to all agree about everything. Do we really have to agree about everything all the time? What is this business about agreement? Now, that doesn't sound like an evil statement, does it? But it's an ill statement from the understanding of the family. It's an illness. People, the family will say, "Who'd you hear that from? Who you've been reading? What have you been talking to?" Or about the internet or whatever, you know, something from the outside that's making somebody who belongs to us act like he's not belonging to us. So now, if you look at it from two sides, that's what family therapists do. We always look at things from at least two sides. If it's a big family, it's a lot more than two sides, but let's say two sides. We look at it from the point of view of the child who says, you know, I was talking to my chavrusa, and in his family not everybody agrees all the time, and they seem to be all right. And so you say, well, from his side, it's something that he's bringing from the outside to the family. From the family side, it's a threat. It's not a bad thing that it's a threat. It's an absolutely natural thing. When your temperature is not normal, you feel like you're heading to the environment. You feel like you're not well. Not well means going to dust, going to the environment. It threatens existence. So then, when the insider, somebody who's supposed to be an insider, makes a statement that sounds like an outsider, we have what's called a family illness, right? You see how an illness can be described as within the system. The child is not necessarily ill. They'll send him to me, and I'll give him my number, you know, and I'll say that he's hysterical, or he's, you know, dependent, or he's God knows what. But a different way of looking at it is to say that the family is dealing with an illness. An illness means something that's not well regulated. It needs to have the regulation changed. Now, when the family is dealing with an insider who's speaking like an outsider, we're at the situation where one possibility is change. What would change be? What would change look like? Either you can put the outsider back into the inside, or the inside can change. And that's what's called second-order change. There's a problem with the slide that I'll explain to you in a minute. This slide is actually, let's go back to the other one. This is second-order change. Second-order change is a term arbitrarily created by family therapists. This could have been called first-order change. It's called, in family therapy, it's called second-order change. What it means is that the family actually broadens its boundaries. The family now says, you know what? Yeah, we can disagree. But when we say we can disagree, that's a deep statement. It means that the we has been redefined, right? That the person who brought in something from the outside, the family has mutually created with him a different definition of we. We can also disagree, right? And if we have things that we don't yet understand about each other, that still includes the we. So the bottom boundary here is changed, right? The definition of the homeostasis has changed to include something. Looking at it from the side of the family, you would say, well, this is a bracha. What's the word bracha mean? Expansion, right? So this is a bracha, something the family has managed to create something new and stay coherent as a family, right? From the point of view of the child, you would say, Gewalt, this wasn't easy, was it, right? And nor should it be easy, right? Because if the child is bringing something that was previously experienced as outside of us, and now the us is being redefined to include it, that's work. That's emotional work. It's not easy, nor should it be easy. So that's what family therapists do sometimes, is they help families to say, wait a minute, you're seeing your child as an outsider. But there's two possibilities. One is that you close him off, which is an awful lot of pain, because he's part of us. Or that maybe he can fall into an us that redefines itself. In other words, that you can mutually create with him. He's bringing in something from what you felt was the environment, and you can say, the we is strong enough to include that too. We can change the we. And so that's painful work, but that's what's called second order change. Those of you who are already thinking differentiation would say, oh, there's a change in the level of differentiation, isn't there? The level of differentiation has moved, right? Why is it moved? Because a conversation that wasn't possible is now possible. That a way of looking at things that wasn't possible is now included in who we are. So when you do family therapy, you're not asking people to say, look, lighten up, be flexible, flow, go with the flow. Yeah, that's not the point. That would be like, just be disengaged. That doesn't work, right? You ask a family, how about redefining the we? How about creating, the we is the precious part of the family. And the child and the family are trying to create a we that includes something that it didn't include before. And if they can do that, they've done something new. If they've done something new, there's been a mutual creation, co-creation that hadn't happened before, so the level of differentiation has gone up. Okay?
Would you say that it's always a child, or it can be one of the spouses who changes the we?
Anybody. I gave the example of the child, but because it's sometimes more common, but people marry young, and then they develop in different ways, and suddenly one has something different to say to the other that wasn't part of what they were saying when they were 10 or 15 years younger. So that happens in couples all the time. They say, what is the definition of the couple? And actually I gave a talk to the Family Therapy Association. The last one I talked to them about was about change of contract. Change of contract, that you create a family or a couple with assumptions. What are the assumptions? These are the assumptions, right? And then people grow and they experience things and they learn to become family therapists, God forbid, or whatever. They start to think a little differently. And then somebody says something that's outside the contract that's deep work. It's not a simple matter on either side. It's not a simple matter on either side. But that's how people change as a group, right? In other words, now as an organism, none of you are able to change your body temperature, are you? That's, and there's nothing you can do.
Not yet.
What's that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, it's possible that some yogis in India know how to do that. Because,
Well, if we continue with global change, then something will have to happen. We'll have to have an
Right.
air conditioner.
You're right. With global, if the world gets hotter, we're all going to have to adjust, but we're going to sweat on the way. So it's hard work, but we can't do it willfully. But human groups are asked to do that all the time. There isn't a human group that can close itself for more than, let's say, a decade or two, because things are changing outside. And if you're open in any way to the outside, there's always going to be this negotiation. And now, obviously, a highly differentiated family would say, Baruch haba, that, oh, you're saying something new, isn't that interesting? That's nice, but we can figure out how to put that into where we also thought, we're all fine. But the lower differentiation families, which are the average, struggle. And when they struggle, it often feels like it's a struggle between members of the group, but it's actually about the definition of the group. And the definition of the group is precious to all the people, including the one who's outside saying, you people are no good, you're so strict, you're so rigid. Why is he saying that? Because he wants to be inside. He wants the group to be able to include him. It's not a struggle between inside and outside, it's a struggle for the inside. Family therapy is a struggle for the inside. It often feels like it's in a different kind of language, but it's a struggle to preserve an inside that's precious to everybody. I see a couple of questions, all on the women's section. Yeah.
So, I hear that what you're saying is that in general, like being higher differentiation means is that people can come up with ideas in the family and be open to accepting them and talking about them. But I'm wondering if too much of that would make the family unstable. And if one kid is coming home with stuff, another kid is coming home with stuff, and the parents are constantly talking about changing and, accepting new things, I feel like it may make it really unstable. Situation.
Okay, we're going to get to that because some families deal with too many things all at once, and then what you see a family will end up doing is instead of being able to negotiate to change the we becomes even more narrow. That's also a second order change, right? If the we that includes 3 statements here narrows itself to only one of them, That's a second order change. We would call it differentiation has gone down, right? In other words, if you have a preemie who needs a lot of attention, and when you're finally done with that, but there's still developmental issues, and then you have another challenged child, or the older child is thrown out of school or something, so you start to feel like, let's make it narrow. And then it'll really feel like us against them. Us against them is the way families sometimes feel when they come in. It's our job to say this is not us against them. We would like it to turn into us for us, but that means that we're going to help you to turn this from a struggle to some sort of growth. The struggle is regulation. We have to get to some kind of regulation. But if we don't also grow, which is the intersubjective, the co-creational part, then how can you make something new without co-creation? Okay? Yeah.
How would you define religion in this context?
Talk a little louder.
How would you define the role of religion and orthodoxy? Because it has boundaries and expectations. How does it fit in?
Right. So, since you asked, every family will define it differently. See, that's where Minuchin is wrong. Every family will define. The question was, and what about Frumkeit? What about Halacha? And what about Torah? Right? Isn't the Torah some sort of a definition which can't be, you can't go outside of that, right? Now, Jewish families have been struggling with that for 150 years, and the first generation saw it as you're in or you're out, right? In other words, but the people who went out went 100% out. In other words, it became socialists, or they became communists, or God forbid Zionists. They became something outside, and the family was unable. But the family oftentimes was unable because in their community they couldn't redefine themselves and be in the community. So they had a tragic choice. That kind of choice changed over time, historically. And what that choice is now in Israel, or in, let's say, Muncie, is a fascinating question. In other words, what do families do with children who bring in something that's outside of what is in the family environment? Most of the time, I think, in a robust society, families and the people who want to make them grow find a way to grow within this, put it this way, halacha is pretty broad in terms of disengagement and enmeshment, right? There's a lot of room there in terms of what can still be considered, I don't decide. There was some rabbi who somebody would accept, would say that this is still a family, and that there's a value to keeping the relationships more than there is to breaking the relationships. It's a gamble, right? The first gamble was you're out, you won't be able to live outside, you'll come back. That gamble doesn't work now. The possibility that if you're out, over time, you or your grandchildren will come back, that's a different gamble. And, I'm not the person to tell you how to think about that. People think different things about that. And we may have this conversation sometime and hear the great variety of the way that people think these days about that question. But within the structure of let's say, a Torah-committed family, the family decides what's us, right? In other words, a lot of things that are decided in the family are decided because that's how we live the Torah, right? And not necessarily how our neighbor, who nobody would say is less good than us, lives it a little differently, right? So each family has its own way of living the Torah. And if you wanted to, you could say a sign of differentiation, a sign of health in the family would be that there's a way of negotiating within the Torah so that there's room for enough people so that people can live in the world as well. Not everybody thinks that. Within the Jewish society, there are societies that say, who wants to live in the world? Let's not live in the world. Let's live in the small world that doesn't have any connection, and then we'll solve that problem, except for everybody who doesn't fit, who's going to be out, right? And other people say, we live in the world. Now, you think that in your families, there's one homogeneous way of living the Torah in the world, right? So the issue is how the family negotiates it. And then if we talk about the function of the subsystem, right? Whether the subsystem of the family that has a place for co-creation, has a place for people in the family to bring in and to figure out how to live with things that are brought in, that family is going to be more secure, right? And a family that's more threatened, that says, look, anything that's a little different and we're all going to collapse, that's a family that's heading for tragedy, right? And those are the people that we'll be seeing. Those are common issues. Usually the issue is not so much that if they didn't have to deal with the Torah, everything would be fine. I don't think so. One of the secular world might say, look, you guys, just, give it up and you'll all be happy. Well, they gave it up and they're not happy, right? So I don't think that's the issue, because every family has something inside of it that's precious. What we're seeing in Israel now, for example, is that, this horrible non-conversation about who's left and who's right, because families haven't found a way to have a way to grow between this is the way it has to be and something a little different. We're in a very low differentiation level fight right now. You don't hear much co-creation going on. But the same is true of families. Within a family, people find what works for them, and the more confident they are that it works for us, the more confident they are that what works for us works. What does it mean that it works? That it's proven for co-creation. Now, what is co-creation? It's a question of the Tosfos that your grandfather didn't ask. That's co-creation. It's a question about how you think inside of yourself when you light Shabbos candles, right? These things happen. These things change over time. If there's room to converse about it, if there's room to grow about it, then the halakha lives better in the world, right? But the more that it becomes, it can only be one way. I mean, there is no one way, right? If there's only one narrow way and anything else is ill and has to be cut off or brought back, then you live in a situation that's more challenged. So that's how I think about it. That's just one person who thinks about it. We're not talking about how you were thinking about it. So what do you think?
No, I was trying to figure it out. I'm just thinking, like, there are, like, in a way, it seems sometimes that being very religious, it can also be Christian or anything.
Say what?
It can be any religion, really, but being very orthodox is, like, less differentiation, because you can't make decisions, and you need to go according to certain rules.
Right.
But on the other hand,
Depends
like you're
if
saying that within that,
See, as you know, no Orthodox Jew ever defined himself as Orthodox. It was defined from the outside, right? The people looking at Fruitkeit said, let's call that Orthodox. It wasn't a compliment, right? It was the idea was that these people think they know what the right thing is. Ortho is right, and dox is their way of thinking, so they have the right way of thinking. It was considered a klala, right? Because it said there is no right way, and these people are narrow, right? But within the frame of Torah, which is one of our words, not somebody else's word, it's not that narrow, right? In other words, if you look even in what would be called the form of the Haredi community, since the Baal Shem Tov, there have been lots of different ways that people stay from. That there were big fights about it, but these days a lot of stuff that was outside is considered inside. There were families when somebody became a chassid, that was the end of the world, and that's over, right? In other words, the world of the health, I think, the health of the firm community has to do with preserving a place for co-creation within the Torah. And if you look at the Torah, there is no spiritual system that sponsors and supports co-creation more than ours. All the other spiritual systems seem to either have a hefkerwelt, or, Buddhist is a bit of a hefkerwelt, or, if you look at the Christians, look at the evangelists now in America, there's no room to breathe. We've always had room to breathe. That's why we're still here, right? That's how I think about it. But the room to breathe is the room to preserve the us, to make it precious, but make it live, make it
A lot
alive.
of people don't understand that.
What's
you're
that?
saying. A lot of in the foreign community, a lot of people don't understand what you're saying.
A lot of people in every community don't understand it. In other words, if you're living in a lower level of differentiation, so the miracle is that there are some people who would understand it. That's the surprise. If you're living in any community, and the lower the differentiation, the more rigid. the less room there is for people to talk to each other. When was there ever a time when you weren't allowed to talk Torah? Talking Torah is everybody agreeing on the same thing, that's talking Torah. What? In other words, but it's within the Torah system, that if there's room to breathe within the Torah system, that makes the us more viable, less threat.
Someone said to me,
But you have another thought, and I may be wrong, I'm just saying how I think today. Yeah.
This is a model of how a family relates to each other.
I want everybody to, I know that there are comments, but let's all listen to each other.
I'm just
Yeah.
thinking you're applying a model of relationships and how families relate to each other.
Right.
A much broader thing when you talk about a religion or a different kind of system. I think it's different rules.
But
I
what?
don't know that you can apply the same rules you're applying to a family, to a system, a society.
I can't hear you.
This question, really, I think that when people are talking about is somebody in or out because of halacha or whatever, it's really, it could be anything that someone thinks
Absolutely.
about. It's just, right, so taking that and then applying that way of thinking to like a society.
Right. Right. In other words, higher differentiation, the us is something that we can negotiate within what's still us, right? And lower differentiation, the us becomes, the we becomes so narrow that there is a room to breathe. Listen, do you think that if you take a family that has 6 sisters in a firm family, and these 6 sisters are raising their children, they're all doing it the same? You live in families, right? You live in big families. They're not all doing it the same. There's room within that because each of the sisters is married to somebody who comes from another family. And that family does it a little differently, right? And so each new family creates its own way of doing it. And the fact that it's within the halakha system isn't the problem. The question is there's room to breathe, room to create. And every couple does that. Every couple is a little different from, they can't be copy-paste of each of the 2 families because each of the 2 families are different, right? So anytime you create a couple, there's something it either involves co-creation or the differentiation goes down. That has nothing to do with the Torah. It has to do with, yeah.
So with higher differentiation, let's say your kid does something, does it mean you'll be okay with it, or you'll be open to it, but it doesn't mean you'll like it?
You'll be what?
Doesn't mean you'll be open to it, but it doesn't mean you have to like it, or it's saying you'll be fine and welcoming the differences.
What's the it?
Yeah, it's the past.
That's the question. What's the it? Somebody wants to convert to another religion. There's not going to be a lot of place for that. But that's an extreme situation. But within the situation, the more things are viable, the more that it's interesting, the more that it lives, and there's place for co-creation, the less you need to go outside for co-creation.
No, I'm saying just because the parent's open to it, doesn't mean they're going to like it.
Say what?
Just because they're open to whatever it is, it doesn't have to be so extreme. It could be less extreme. It could be their friends' choice, their kids' choice of friends, or what they're reading, or
Right.
even the smallest thing.
Right.
So they can still negotiate it, but obviously doesn't
Right.
mean they have to.
Most of what goes on in life is not at the extremes.
Right.
There's a very common statement that extreme cases make bad laws because, you try to figure out how to do most of the stuff. The extreme cases have to be dealt with differently. Okay, so this is a very important conversation. I want to move on to the issue of time because, as I said, and you suggested it earlier, time creates change, right? The outer world is changing and the inner world of the family is changing. For example, you say to yourself, as we talk with adolescents, you said, well, do you want to talk to your kid when he's 5 the same as you talk to him when he's 15? Why would you want to talk to him when he's 15 the way you talked to him when he was 5? So how are you going to create the me and my son at 15 that's not given from anywhere? You have to create it. So there has to be room for co-creation, right? So now if we look at time, I just wanted to clarify one last thing. This is a mistake in the slide. If you're going from the inside, from one level that's in the inside to another level to the inside, that's what's called first order change. In other words, you haven't changed the boundaries, you haven't changed the level of differentiation, you've moved a little bit within what was always considered us. That's called first order change. And that's not a change in differentiation, it's a different level change. So now, let's move on to, remember the Bryce family? Okay, let's see how time moves in the Bryce family, because we want to ask ourselves, why is the Bryce family in trouble? What's the trouble? The trouble is that Claudia is acting outside of the we, right? Claudia is going out and doing things that we don't do. This is not a firm family, it's just an American family in the 60s. Claudia is out and doing something that we don't do. She's ill, right? Because she's acting like the environment and not like the inner environment, right? Now, why is this happening now, and what does it have to do with time? So let's look at the, as you're all familiar with the genogram, and let's put a timeline under it, okay? This isn't my idea, but I think it's a useful thing to do. So you make a column for each of the people in the family, and you watch how the family grows over time, okay? So now, I made up some of this because not all of it's in the book, but let's say David and Caroline are 24 and 22 when they get married, okay? And then we have Claudia being born. We have a couple that's 25 and 23. And then when Don is born, because being born in a family happens over time, and when it happens over time, it changes the family. Things need to be renegotiated. Sometimes there are challenges we haven't had before. So when Don is born, oh, look at that. We have 29 and 27, and Claudia is 4. So we would ask ourselves, what was it like for Claudia when Don was born? Right? Anybody this is stuff you learned from Barbara in the first semester. For the 4-year-old, having a new sibling is emotional work. It's nothing that could be anticipated. 4-year-olds don't anticipate things. But when they happen, they usually misunderstand them unless they're helped to move along with it. So Claudia is 4 when Dawn is born. And when Laura is born, we have 33, 8, 4, and 31. And now we get to Claudia, who's 13. And we say to ourselves, oh, Claudia is 13, so now there's a big one, right? Because we have the beginning of adolescence. So the family has to start to approach Claudia in a different way. Don is 9, but look at this, Laura is 5. Nowhere in the family crucible is that ever mentioned. But let's say this is an American family. They knew they were going to have 3 children. And Laura is now 5. What happens when the youngest child, especially if it's a daughter, is 5?
They go to school.
What's that?
They go to school.
They start to go out, right? In other words, aside from the fact that in America they start to go to school, you know, there's the Israeli term for the preschool age is gil harach. It's soft, it's tender. A family is tender until the kids stop being so tender. And kids around 5 become a lot less tender. And a lot of times you'll find that families function very well as each child gets to be about 3, there's another one, right? And so there's always tenderness. And in a Haredi family, there can be tenderness going on for 20 years. And then there are grandchildren, so you never lose it. In this family, Laura is no longer tender. And so we say, what's that like for Caroline? Now, Caroline had Claudia when she was 23. So now, for 13 years, Caroline has had somebody tender to take care of. A baby, somebody soft, somebody who listens, somebody who loves mom and gives her, you know, love and closeness. And suddenly, Caroline is left without somebody tender. She has to deal with a 5-year-old and let her go off to school and go off to become Laura and not mommy's baby. And she has this adolescent. So we have 2 changes happening simultaneously. This isn't written in the family crucible, but these are the ages, right? So then you can say, so what's Carolyn? How is Carolyn going to negotiate tenderness now? And who is responsible for her experiences of tenderness? It's a Jimmy Durante song. I don't know if you know it. Try a little tenderness. Who's going to be tender with Carolyn now? And there are 2 possibilities. One is David. That's what we would hope would be sort of optimal. But he hasn't been doing that for the last 13 years. He's been busy becoming a lawyer. And there isn't a lot tender about being lawyers in America. And so you say, so who's going to be involving Caroline in being this closely engaged mother? And then we could say to ourselves, look at that. Claudia is starting to act like a baby, right? She's having mom involved with every little aspect of her clothes, every little aspect of her body. She's bringing mom close to her body. That's what promiscuous young ladies do. They bring their mother into their bodies, right? Into thinking about what they're doing with their bodies. So we could say to ourselves, is Claudia ill, or is Claudia saving Laura? In other words, is Claudia going back to becoming the tender one? You can't become tender and adolescent by being pleasant, so she's unpleasant tender. And is that allowing Laura to grow up? It's a different way of thinking about it, which you can now put into the family crucible. So you see, we have a timeline that helps us to understand sort of snapshots of different phases of the family growth. This situation, Claudia, I moved it up to the treatment, where Claudia is 15 and Laura is 7, that's an objective passage. Objective means that it happens that way in all families. When a kid is 13, she's 13. When a kid is 6, she's 6. Those kinds of passages are objective passages. In this case, it's a double objective passage. That brings to mind what you said about families being burdened. The two of them are happening simultaneously. This happens all the time in American families. If, American families don't think about it until the oldest one is an adolescent, and the youngest one is going to school, and then whoop! What's the us? It's a whole different story. But that's a double objective passage. There were two other forms of passages. And so what we're going to do, with your permission, is to make the Bryce family grow. And they finished the treatment when Claudia was 18, Dawn was 14, and Laura was 10. This is going past the book. We're imagining the future. It happens that it's already the past because the book is old. But you take this family and say, where is it going? What else is waiting for them? And then we'll have Claudia being 22, Laura's 14. Now what are we going to do, right? And she's becoming adolescent, and Dawn is leaving. And then we get to Claudia, we have Laura being an adolescent. So those are all objective passages, right? They happen in all families, they're age-related, and they're universal. But I decided that when Claudia is 25, she's going to get married. And then she's going to have a child. And when David is 70 and Caroline is 55, which is more or less now, Claudia's children are now 15 and 11. Oh, 15. 15. Well, it's been a long time, but that's when Claudia became ill, wasn't it? Right? So the fact that she has this 15-year-old is not just an objective passage, it's also what we would call a subjective passage. It reminds us of what happened in the past. If you talk to people whose parents divorced, when they get to the age that their same gender parent was when the divorce happened, or when they have children the age that they were when the divorce happened, they suddenly feel like, I don't know, this marriage is not working. And there's nothing that happened in the marriage. It's a subjective passage. It reminds you of something that happened in the past. So here we have Claudia with a 15-year-old who's picking at her food. And we say, uh-oh, this is going to turn into this subjective passage, which is, you ask Claudia, do you remember Whitaker and Napier, those people that treated me? She said, oh, it was a long time ago. I just remember that, my mom got off my back afterwards, and, But my 15-year-old is driving me crazy now. My 15-year-old. It's a subjective passage. And so, we're going to have to deal with what to do. That's a subjective passage. And I'm just adding one more piece to it, which doesn't show up in this slide where it is, but you see David is 70 and Caroline is 18, is 68. But Caroline has been a very engaged grandmother with this 15-year-old. Guess why? Because she's trying to get right what she got wrong with Claudia. So she's been a very engaged grandmother. And now when this oldest girl is 15, David, who's a workaholic, says, it's time to retire. And I'm leaving my practice to Claudia, who became a lawyer. And he says to Caroline, and you and I were going on the cruise that I've been promising you for the last 20 years. So it's come. Time has come. And now David says to Caroline, we're going on a cruise. Caroline says, a cruise? You see what's happening with this 15-year-old? We're going to mess it up again? What do you mean a cruise? Now, is every grandmother involved with a 15-year-old grandchild? No. Is this grandmother involved with this grandchild? Is she part of the emotional system? Yes. So we need a different term for this, because this is not a subjective passage, because it's happening now, but it's not universally objective, right? So we would call it pragmatic, in the sense that a pragmatic passage is one that has to do with this particular emotional system. In other words, Caroline, Claudia, and this girl is a particular emotional system, but it's a passage, because now when Caroline is not going to be involved with this girl, that's going to be one big passage for Claudia, who's going to have to deal with it by herself instead of with her grandmother. You follow that? So there are two kinds of here and now passages. One are objective in the sense that they're universal, and the other are pragmatic in the sense that it doesn't happen that way in every family, but it represents the emotional system in this particular family. And then there are subjective passages. So look what we have when Claudia's girl is 15. We have an objective passage or two, we have a pragmatic passage, and we have a subjective passage. Now, what's that going to do to the differentiation of the family? You see how this family is now being asked to recreate itself, to go through what happened 20 years ago, and to go through what's happening now, and to go through David and Caroline, who had never got renegotiated. And so this is a family that's going to be stressed at this particular moment. And the environment has created something that can no longer be managed in the usual way. So there's going to be a need either for co-creation, which would mean differentiation would go up. And if they won't find Whitaker because he's dead, but they can find Napier still, and go into family therapy, and have the therapist turn the passage into growth and differentiation going up. Or if it's left with its own devices, it probably is going to mean that the differentiation is going to go down, and we're going to hospitalize the girl with an eating disorder. And when we decide that she has an eating disorder, we're going to ignore all of this, right? Which wouldn't be so smart to do, right? Because we could diagnose her as having an eating disorder, but look at all the different meanings, and look at the opportunity and the challenge. Eunice?
Could this still happen even if, let's say, Laura worked through with her own daughter, like back in the day, but like now she has a granddaughter, and like feelings of guilt or whatever it is comes back up and it re-happens? Or
anything can happen. Anything can happen. No.
Like less likely, I'm saying if she processed it back then and worked through it?
I imagine this family. From the moment you close the family crucible, this is my imagination. You can imagine something else.
Right, no.
As a matter of fact, it would be,
as an example.
go ahead and do it. It's a good idea. Each of you want to take the family crucible and map it 20 years later and see what you imagine. That's fine. Yeah.
No, I'm saying as an example, like it's less likely these patterns would happen if they worked it through, obviously, earlier.
Oh yeah, no, it's entirely
It happens
possible.
either way because you get triggered to remember.
Had we, see, let's do a little wish list for Whitaker and Napier, and for all of you family therapists, nascent family therapists. Let's leave a wish list that when you finish the therapy, you've already thought about the next passage. In other words, that when you say to yourself, okay, we're done with Claudia because she's 18 and families, but you say to yourself, let's just map this another few years and see what the next passage is. When Laura's 17, that's going to be in a while, but the family's going to be, let's see if we can help the family to go forward and be able to go through the next passage well. Families sometimes come back for therapy, usually around the next passage, and a lot of times the therapist says to themselves, well, the previous therapy failed. Didn't fail, but it's possible that we didn't think about how to get them past the next passage. So if we were to say to Whitaker and Napier, okay, you guys are finished, but come back every 2 years for a meeting, and we'll sort of pick up the threads and see how we can keep things alive and keep the differentiation moving until Laura is 17 and you get past that one too. That wouldn't be science fiction, would it? Sometimes the family will do it themselves. They'll say, oh, Laura's 17, and David says, oh, listen, Caroline, let's you and I go out for dinner and rehearse what we learned from Whitaker and Napier because we need it again. Does that happen often? Not too often. Is it possible? Probably. I just want to show you one last thing here, which is that this isn't such an original idea. This is the family of man and our family. And if you use the years from Briat Olam, you learn a certain number of things. One is that the first person who was born after Adam HaRishon died was Noach. Now, who did that calculation? Not me. The Abarbanel did it. And he was good with numbers. And he said that's what Zayinach Hamenu means. In other words, Lemach, Noach's father, said, maybe the curse was personal on Adam HaRishon. So the human family has a major passage. Adam HaRishon lived a long time, but he's finally gone. And now that he's gone, maybe the curse is over. And this first person born after the curse, maybe he won't have the curse anymore. That didn't work, right? But it gives us a way of following the line of development. That's the Abarbanel's idea. If you follow it a little bit further, you should say, so what happened when Noach died? Right? You would ask that question. And the answer is that when Noach died, Avraham was already around for a while, but the first thing that happened after Noach died is Lech Lecha, right? And that is another way of understanding why we need to know that Lech Lecha happened when Avraham was 75, because he was 56 when Noach died. So this is the first event that happened after Noach died. Now you would say, okay, so what happened when Avraham died? That you already know, right? That's Parshat Toldot. You know, that's when they were sitting Shiva and Avraham, and that's when Yaakov and Esav start to have trouble, right? So that's Galui, and the Abarbanel figured out the first one. In the middle, Lech Lecha also figures out.
Who did this, you said?
What's that?
Who wrote that? Because it's...
About Noach?
Oh, you said the name, just
Abarbanel. Abarbanel, depends how you pronounce it.
So why is it important to know the flood happening, the first event after his father died?
What?
And this why was it important to know the first event after his father died?
Why was what?
Why was it important to know the first event, that the flood was the first event?
So the flood wasn't the first event. What happened was that the first thing that happened after Noach died was Lech Lecha. Avraham was born, Noach was still alive. You know, if you look at the numbers, the idea of Shivat, Sheba, and Eber, the numbers work, right? The way we have the numbers. But the first thing that happened after Noach died is Lech Lecha. So it gives you a little hint, if you add up the numbers, that maybe it was only possible once Noach died. Same way that Noach was Zayinach Hamenu, because the idea was that finally after Adam HaRishon died, things can change in the family, right? That's just a way of thinking. It's not, you know, just so you can see that it's around. Now, we're going to do a small targil here, and I want to show it to you so that you can see what we're going to do. Here it is. This is what you're going to have. These are your family, right? And we're going to map a past transition when something happened to me in my family of origin. Family of origin is the family you were brought up in, right? So we put in enough people. So here you are. You're here. And you could be somewhere else in the line, but you had to be somewhere for the thing. This is on your father's side, grandparents. This is on your mother's side, grandparents. And now we're going to say, when did something significant happen in my childhood? Right? When I say, oh, something changed in the family, right? And then we put a year on it and map everybody, right? And try to figure out what were the significances, what was the central triangle there, what were the challenges, what kind of passages were there, and how is it still being worked out. So that's today's targil. And you see you have the date, and then you have a place for the grandfather's age. Over here is the grandmother's age, and father and me, somebody else, because maybe there's an uncle or aunt that's relevant, and then the same in the mother's family as you go off to here. Okay, so, yeah. And announcements, yeah. A couple of announcements. First announcement, there are the happy announcements. The first announcement has to do with, for those of you who are interested, the Israel Association of Couples and Family Therapy is coming for a site visit on Sunday afternoon, and that will complete, apparently, our process of application. The person who's the head of Hasmacha for programs and for supervisors called me on Monday to just ask a minor question. The minor question was about my application. He said, did you ever do family therapy? So that was an interesting question. Fortunately, the answer to the question was okay, but he had no other questions, and he said, you know, we're going to give you an answer very soon. So we may, within the coming weeks, know where we stand with accreditation, and it looks to me like we're going to be on the way to it if we're not already there. So that's a happy event. And the second thing is that we now have an alumni association, and the Alumni Association is sponsoring a lecture this evening in the Pius Auditorium, because it's just going to be jam-packed. Couldn't put it here. And Dr. David Flashman from Beit Shemesh is going to be talking about anxiety and other things. So we're very happy both to have him come and talk about things psychiatric, and that we have an alumni association who will now be creating all sorts of programs that makes them want to continue learning, so that this is your future. So hopefully you're going to have a present and a future, God willing. And Dina, was there something else I was going to announce?
No.
That's it? Okay. So on to your families. Try to see what it's like to map yourselves, and we'll continue.